At my daughter's wedding, my husband couldn't take his eyes off another woman. That woman was his own daughter. And what I found in his jacket pocket that night changed everything I believed about my marriage, my family, and myself. The morning after my daughter's wedding, she called me crying. Not about her new husband, about mine. What she told me in that bridal suite is the thing I've carried ever since, and the thing I'm finally ready to put down. Stay with me, and I'll tell you everything. Before I tell you what I witnessed that afternoon, tell me in the comments where you watch me from so I can find stories from your hometown. And like this video, because once I begin, you won't be able to walk away. This story changed my life, and I have a feeling it's going to change something in yours too. I have always believed that the Lord gives you signs. Not the thunderclap kind, not the burning bush or the parted sea. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives like a shift in the air before rain, like the way a candle flame bends before the window is even open. I believe he gives you those signs because he loves you too much to let the blow land without warning. I missed every single one that day. My name is Stepdaughter Pruitt Monroe, and I am 63 years old. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, to a mother who could stretch $1 into a week and a father who believed that a black woman's education was the one thing no one could ever take from her. I took that belief and I ran with it. 31 years as a licensed social worker in Charlotte, North Carolina, 10 of them as a department supervisor. I have sat across from grief in every shape it comes. I thought I knew how to recognize it before it arrived. That Saturday in September, I did not recognize a thing. The wedding was held at Harvest House, a restored plantation-era estate on the outskirts of Charlotte that the current owners had spent 20 years converting into something beautiful, instead of something haunted. My daughter Simone, 29 years old, stubborn as good cast iron, brilliant in ways that still astonish me, had chosen it for the ceremony because of the old oak trees lining the drive and the light that comes through the chapel windows in the late afternoon, like something that has been waiting there patiently for exactly this occasion. I had driven past those trees the evening before the wedding and cried, not from sadness, from the fullness of it, the sheer accumulated weight of everything it had taken to get Simone to this day whole, healthy, and chosen by a man who deserved her. That man was Deshaun Carter, 32, an electrical engineer from Greensboro, quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. He had brought my daughter flowers the first time he came to my house for dinner, and he had brought me flowers too, without being prompted, without performance. I had decided then that he was a good man. The years since had only confirmed it. The morning of the wedding, I woke before my alarm. My room at the estate's guest cottage was pale with early light, and I lay still for a moment in that half-awake space where everything feels possible, where grief and trouble haven't yet remembered to find you. I thought about Simone at age 4, falling asleep in my lap during Sunday service, her small hand curled around my finger. I thought about the first time she called a boy on the telephone and how she had stretched the cord around the corner of the kitchen wall thinking I couldn't hear her laughing. I thought, I have done my part. Now I get to watch her fly. I got up, put on my robe, made a cup of coffee from the small machine on the cottage dresser, and sat by the window. That was when I saw them. My husband, Leonard Monroe, 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples that he wore the way some men wear an inheritance, was standing on the gravel path below the cottage window. He was dressed already, which surprised me because Leonard does not dress early. Leonard believes in leisure the way some men believe in religion. He was talking to Deja. Deja Renee Monroe, his daughter from his relationship before me, 21 years old, visiting from Nashville, where she had moved the previous spring to pursue something in music that I had never quite gotten a clear answer about. Deja was tall, watchful, with a kind of compressed energy about her that always made me feel slightly off balance, as though the floor beneath us operated on rules she understood and I did not. They stood close together on that gravel path in the September morning, and Leonard was speaking in a low, concentrated way. The way he speaks when he wants to be sure he is heard and understood. Deja was nodding slowly, her arms crossed over her chest, and once she looked up at him with an expression that I could not fully read from the window. I told myself they are father and daughter. This is their time. Let them have it. I drank my coffee. I got dressed. I did not ask Leonard what they had been talking about when he came inside 40 minutes later, smelling of the cool morning air and something else, some faint, unsettled energy that I noticed and immediately decided not to trust. That decision, that small domestic act of choosing peace over inquiry, is the one I have replayed 1,000 times since. Because if I had asked him that morning, the rest of that day might have gone differently. I might have had my eyes open before the reception. I might have been prepared for what I was about to see, what the entire room was about to see, in front of 200 people who would all go home that night with the same thought in their heads, and not one of them would say it to my face. There's something I want you to hold on to as this story unfolds. I was not a naive woman. I was not a woman who ignored trouble. I was a woman who had spent 31 years reading people for a living, and I still didn't see it coming. That should tell you something about how carefully it had been hidden. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. By 2, the estate had filled with the warm noise of a family gathering its branches. Cousins from as far as Memphis and Newark, old church friends of mine from Birmingham, colleagues of Deshawn's from Greensboro, Simone's college roommates from Spelman, who arrived in a loud, beautiful cluster and immediately took over the getting ready suite with the confidence of women who have known each other long enough to dispense with formality. I moved through all of it like a woman who has learned to be present in a room while her mind works quietly in another one. Simone was radiant. That is the word. Not beautiful, not pretty, but radiant. The way certain people are on certain days when everything inside them has arrived at the surface at once. Her dress was ivory with a fitted bodice, and her natural hair was swept up and pinned with small pearl clips that had belonged to my mother. When I fastened the clasp of her grandmother's pearl necklace at the back of her neck, she caught my eyes in the mirror and held them for a moment. "You did good, Mama," she said. "You did good," I told her. "I just paid attention." She laughed and squeezed my hand. That moment, that specific, irreplaceable moment, is the one I return to when everything else about that day tries to hollow me out. Because I need to remember that the day was also that it contained that. Leonard found me just before the processional in the hallway outside the chapel, adjusting the gardenia on my lapel. He kissed my cheek. He told me I looked stunning. And I believed him because Leonard had always known how to look at me in a way that made me believe what he said. "Ready?" he asked. "More than ready," I said. We walked Simone down the aisle together, one of us on either side of her, which had been her idea, and which had made both Leonard and me emotional when she proposed it. Those 120 steps felt simultaneously like the longest and the shortest walk of my life. The chapel was filled with afternoon light, exactly as I had imagined, and Deshaun was waiting at the altar with the look of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune. The vows were written by Simone and Deshaun themselves. She had not shared them with me beforehand, and when I heard them, I understood why. They were private in the way that all the best things are private, built from specific personal knowledge of each other that no one else in that room could fully decode. But they were also universal in the way that all the best things are universal, and there was not a dry eye in the chapel by the time they were finished. When Reverend Patricia Holloway Barnes pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel exhaled. I exhaled. Leonard reached for my hand. I gave it to him. And for one long, golden moment, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. The reception moved to the main hall of Harvest House, a vast, high-ceilinged room with exposed timber beams and long tables dressed in ivory and deep green, candles everywhere. An 8-piece band called Indigo Road, who had been playing Charlotte weddings for 15 years and knew exactly how to read a room. The smell of rosemary and warm bread drifted from the kitchen. Glasses caught the candlelight and threw it back in small, moving constellations across the ceiling. I was seated at the main family table between Leonard and my oldest friend, Dorothy Mae Crawford, who has been my closest companion since we were 24 years old, and who has outlasted 2 of my bad decisions and 1 of my good ones, and is still here to comment freely on all of them. The first hour was everything I had hoped for. Then I started to watch Leonard, not deliberately, not with suspicion, the way you watch someone you love in a public space. Half attending, checking in the way that long marriage teaches you. The peripheral awareness that is not quite consciousness and not quite instinct, but something between the two. What I saw was small at first. Leonard refilled Deja's water glass before he refilled mine. He leaned toward her during the toasts, not dramatically, just a slight incline of the body. The kind that happens when you are more invested in one person's reaction than another's. When the band played a song I didn't recognize, Leonard said something to Deja that made her laugh, a full, unguarded laugh that she covered with her hand, and he watched her laugh with an expression on his face that I had seen before. I had seen it on his face when he looked at me, in the early years, before marriage had become comfortable, before comfort had softened into something less deliberate. Dorothy Mae, beside me, reached for her champagne without looking at me and said very quietly, "Celestine." Just my name, nothing else. That single word spoken in Dorothy Mae's voice carried the weight of 39 years of friendship, of every conversation we'd ever had in kitchens and church parking lots and hospital waiting rooms. It carried what she could not say aloud in that room. I turned and met her eyes. She looked at me steadily, calmly, with that particular expression of a woman who loves you enough to hold the mirror even when you don't want it. I looked away first. I picked up my fork. I took a bite of something I did not taste. I told myself, with every tool of professional training I possessed, that I was reading the situation wrong. But here is the thing about being a social worker for 31 years. You spend your entire career teaching yourself not to talk yourself out of what you clearly see. You spend 3 decades learning to trust the signal before it becomes a crisis. You build that skill deliberately, painstakingly, until it is as natural as breathing. And sitting at that table, with Dorothy Mae's voice still hanging in the air between us, every one of those 31 years looked back at me and said, "You see it. You see exactly what this is. You know that feeling when your body understands something your mind is still negotiating?" That is where I was. And what happened during the first dance 30 minutes later made negotiation impossible. Deshawn and Simone danced their first dance to a song I had never heard before. Something slow and current that Simone had discovered and played for me over the phone 6 weeks earlier, asking what I thought. I had told her it was beautiful. Hearing it now in that room with my daughter in her husband's arms, I understood what the song was actually about in a way that a phone speaker cannot communicate. It was about choosing, about the specific, daily, deliberate act of choosing one person above the noise of every other possible life. I watched my daughter choose and be chosen, and I held that image in my chest like a kept promise. Then the band opened the floor to general dancing, and the room began to move. Leonard stood up. I assumed he was coming to take my hand. We are not demonstrative dancers. Leonard jokes that the Lord gave him rhythm and then took it back. But we dance at weddings, because weddings are one of the few occasions when the rules relax and people permit themselves the small grace of swaying together in public without explanation. He did not come to me. He crossed to the edge of the dance floor where Deja was standing with a glass of champagne speaking to one of Simone's cousins. He said something to her. She handed her glass to the cousin, and then they moved onto the floor together. I want to be exact about what I describe, because I am a precise woman and I do not exaggerate when precision is what the moment requires. They did not dance wildly. There was no spectacle. What there was closeness, a proximity that exceeded what I would call paternal, a quality of attention in Leonard's posture that was focused in a direction I recognized and had not seen aimed anywhere but at me in 11 years of marriage. His hand was on her back, low. Her chin was near his shoulder. They were speaking, slowly, privately, and once Deja closed her eyes briefly, the way a person does when they are receiving something that matters, 4 people at my table had gone still. Dorothy May had stopped speaking entirely. Simone's aunt, Marguerite, who was visiting from Newark, and who does not miss things, was looking at her plate with a careful blankness that told me she was looking at it on purpose. The wedding planner, a meticulous young woman named Brianna Okafor, passed our table and followed my gaze across the room, and then looked back at me with an expression she rearranged into professionalism so quickly I might have imagined it. Might have. I did not imagine it. I picked up my champagne, I drank, I set it down. I am 63 years old. I have buried a parent. I have navigated the collapse of a previous relationship. I have sat across from families in crisis and helped them find the thread that leads toward survival. I know what it looks like when a room is holding its breath on your behalf, when the people around you have arrived at a conclusion before you have permitted yourself to reach it. That room was holding its breath. And somewhere underneath my professional composure, underneath my practiced stillness, something was happening that I had no framework for, because I had built every framework I possessed on the assumption that Leonard Monroe was one of the fixed points of my world, the place you return to when everything else shifts. Fixed points, I was learning, can move. The dance ended. Leonard kissed Deja on the top of her head. She pressed her palm briefly to his chest, a gesture so natural, so habitual in its ease that it clearly was not the first time. And then she turned and walked back toward the edge of the room. Leonard returned to the table. He sat down beside me. He reached for his drink and said, "Deja's really something, isn't she? She's grown into herself so well." There was pride in his voice, warmth, absolute unself-conscious ease. I said, "She has." My voice was steady. It has always been steady. My mother would have been proud. Dorothy May excused herself to find the restroom and did not return for 11 minutes. When she came back, she put her hand on my shoulder from behind before she sat down. One firm, brief pressure, the language of women who know what cannot be said. I reached up and covered her hand with mine for exactly 1 second. Then the band played something bright and people laughed and more couples moved to the floor and the evening continued its beautiful, terrible momentum. Later, much later, when the hall had emptied and the candles had burned to their bases and Simone and Deshawn had gone and most of the guests had found their way to cars and cottages, I went to get Leonard's jacket from the coat room. He had left it on a chair near the entrance. I picked it up to bring it to him. Something slipped out of the inside pocket and fell to the floor. A phone? Not Leonard's phone. I know his phone, a second phone, small and dark, that landed face up on the hardwood, screen still lit. The last message on the screen read, "Tonight was perfect. Don't let her ruin it. Come to the East Cottage. I'll leave the light on." D. I stood in that empty coat room holding my husband's jacket, reading a message from my stepdaughter. And I want you to understand, it was not the message itself that broke something open in me. It was the word ruin, because she meant me. I was the one who was supposed to be capable of ruining it. At my own daughter's wedding, the coat room was small and smelled of cedar and stale perfume. I stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Time had gone strange the way it does when the mind is processing something it did not expect to process tonight, this night of all nights, the night that was supposed to be the fullness of everything I had worked for. I read the message again. Don't let her ruin it. 3 words that mapped a geography I had not known existed, a geography in which I was the obstacle, the spoiler, the presence that required management. In my own family, at my own daughter's wedding, I put the phone back in the jacket pocket. I shook the jacket once, the way you shake a garment to smooth it, and I walked back into the hall. Leonard was at the bar, speaking with Deshawn's father, Harold Carter, a big, easy-laughing man from Greensboro who I'd always liked. Leonard looked up when I approached, took the jacket from my hands with a smile, and said, "Thank you, baby." "Of course," I said. "I am a social worker. My entire career has been built on the discipline of holding what I know at a distance from what I show, not to deceive, but to preserve the space in which truth can eventually be examined without the distortion of immediate emotion. I have sat with mothers who had discovered things about their children that no mother should ever have to hold. I have sat with fathers who had found evidence of things they had been denying for years. I know what it costs to maintain your face when the floor has just dropped out from under you. That night, it cost me everything I had. I said goodnight to Harold Carter. I kissed Dorothy May on the cheek when she left, and she held my face in both her hands for a moment, just a moment, and looked at me the way she has been looking at me since we were 24 years old, which is to say, with complete knowledge and total love and the unspoken promise that she will be wherever I need her to be when I am ready to speak. I nodded once. She let go. I got into the car with Leonard. He drove. He talked about the wedding, the food, the band, the speech that Deshawn's cousin had given that had gone on 4 minutes too long. He talked the way a man talks when he is in a good mood and does not expect the silence beside him to mean anything. I responded, appropriately, warmly even, because I was not ready. Not yet, not in a moving car, not on the night of my daughter's wedding, not without knowing more than I currently knew. What I currently knew was a message, a second phone, a word, ruin, that had assigned me a role in a story I had not been given the script to. and a day full of small, accumulated observations that had been quietly building towards something I was only now permitted to name. What I did not yet know. How long? How deep? What this was, precisely, in all its dimensions and history and implication. Whether Leonard had gone to that cottage, whether the East Cottage light was burning at this moment on the other side of the estate grounds, whether my marriage was the thing I believed it to be or something else entirely. We pulled up to our guest cottage. Leonard got out and opened my door. He has always done that, has always been that kind of man in the visible ways, the performing well in public ways. And I took his hand as I stepped out and felt the familiar solid warmth of it. Inside, he was asleep within 20 minutes. I lay beside him in the dark, eyes open, listening to the night sounds of the estate, crickets, the distant bass note of a frog somewhere near the pond, the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to say, "Celestine, the truth doesn't knock. It walks through whatever door is open." A door had been opened tonight, and the truth had walked through it, calmly and without apology, and was now standing in the room with me, waiting for me to finish pretending it wasn't there. I thought about Simone, asleep somewhere in the main house with her new husband, on the first night of the life she had chosen. I thought about how carefully I had tried to protect her from every unnecessary pain, how much of my adult life had been organized around that project of protection. She did not know. She could not know. Not tonight, but tomorrow was coming. And with it, questions I could no longer defer. There is a kind of decision that does not feel like a decision in the moment. It feels like simply becoming more yourself, like the quiet hardening of something that was always in you but required the right pressure to reveal its true shape. In the dark of that cottage beside my sleeping husband, I made that kind of decision. I would not burn anything down in grief. I would not act from the raw, unprocessed place that wanted to. God forgive me, I would not. I would look at this clearly. I would find out what was true. I would proceed with the full force of everything I had built over 63 years of living, the intelligence, the patience, the absolute refusal to be diminished. But then, at 6:47 in the morning, my phone lit up on the nightstand. It was Simone. She was already crying. My daughter, on the morning after her wedding, before the sun had fully risen, calling me in tears. And what she said in that call made everything I had found the night before seem like only the surface of a story that went far, far deeper than 1 second phone and one late-night message. Simone's voice on the phone was the voice of a child, not a 29-year-old woman, not a Spelman graduate, not the composed, precise person who had written her own wedding vows without a single correction. The voice on the phone was 6 years old and had woken from a bad dream and needed her mother, and the sound of it did something to my chest that 31 years of professional training could not buffer. "Mama." That was all she said first, just that. "I'm here," I said. I was already sitting up, already swinging my legs over the side of the bed, already reaching for my robe on the chair beside the nightstand. Beside me, Leonard did not stir. "Baby, what's wrong? Talk to me." A pause. The kind of pause that isn't hesitation. It's the gathering of something too large to come out in pieces. "I need you to come to the main suite," she said. "I need you to come now. And Mama, don't bring Leonard." I have spent 31 years listening to the space around words, the pause before an answer, the breath before a disclosure, the particular quality of silence that tells you someone is deciding how much of the truth they can bear to give and receive at the same time. I heard all of that in those 8 words. Don't bring Leonard. I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said. I dressed in the dark, quietly, efficiently, and I walked out of that cottage into the early September morning without waking my husband. The air outside was cool and carried the smell of damp grass and the faint, sweet residue of last night's flowers. The sky was that pale, uncertain gray that precedes real dawn, the light that hasn't committed to itself yet. I walked the path toward the main house with my hands in my pockets and my mind doing what my mind does. Organizing, categorizing, building the framework before the information fully arrives so that when it does, there is somewhere for it to land. What I knew? Simone was crying. She did not want Leonard present. She had called me specifically at 6:47 on the morning after her wedding. What I did not know, whether what she was about to tell me was connected to what I had found in Leonard's jacket pocket the night before, what my body already believed that it was. Deshaun was in the main suite when I arrived. He opened the door, and I could see immediately that he had not slept. His eyes carried the specific bruised quality of a night spent awake with something that would not resolve itself into peace. He was still in the clothes he had changed into after the reception. He looked at me for a moment before he stepped back to let me in, and in that look was something I recognized from my years of professional work, the look of someone who has received information they did not ask for and cannot return. "She's in the bedroom," he said. "She's been up since 2. "Thank you, Deshaun," I said. I put my hand briefly on his arm. "I'm glad you called her." "She called you herself," he said quietly. "I told her she should. I told her this morning. Some things need a mother." I looked at him then, really looked, and I made a note of what I saw. A man who was not angry, not defensive, not scrambling to control the narrative. A man who was hurt and was sitting inside that hurt with his eyes open. I had always trusted Deshaun Carter. In that moment, I trusted him more. Simone was sitting on the edge of the bed in the large bridal suite, still in the silk robe she'd been given by her bridesmaids the morning before, her grandmother's pearl necklace still around her neck. Her hair had come partly down from its pins. She had been crying for a long time. Her eyes carried the puffed, resigned quality of tears that have run their first course and are now returning in waves. She looked up when I came in. "Close the door, Mama," she said. I closed it. I crossed the room and sat beside her and did not say anything because there are moments when the most professional, the most maternal, the most human thing you can do is simply arrive and wait. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me the way she has been leaning into me since she was tall enough to reach my shoulder, and for a long moment we just sat there while the pale morning pressed against the windows. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 4 words. A question that assumed I already had the answer, and the fact that she was asking me, her mother, on the morning of the first day of her marriage, meant that whatever she knew, she had been carrying it alone. The question was, for how long? I kept my arm around my daughter, and I kept my voice exactly level when I answered. "Known what, baby?" I said. "Tell me what you're talking about." She pulled back slightly so she could look at my face. Simone has always been able to read me. She gets it from me, that skill, though she would probably not appreciate the comparison in this moment. She studied my face for a moment the way she used to study a math problem as a child, patiently, methodically, refusing to guess. "You don't know," she said, not a question, a conclusion. I know some things, I said carefully. I found something last night, but I want to hear what you know first. She nodded slowly. She folded her hands in her lap, a gesture so composed, so deliberate, that it broke my heart a little because I recognized it as something she had learned from me. Then she told me. She had found out 3 weeks before the wedding. She had been at Leonard's house, our house in Charlotte, picking up some boxes she had stored in the basement before the move into her and Deshawn's new place. Leonard was at work. I was at a conference in Raleigh. Deja was supposedly in Nashville, except Deja was not in Nashville. Deja was upstairs in the guest room asleep at 2 in the afternoon. Simone had found her there by accident, had heard movement, assumed it was the cat, opened the door. Deja had startled awake. There had been a long, awkward moment in which neither of them spoke. And then Simone had looked around the room. She described it to me carefully. In the precise, architectural way she describes things when she is keeping her emotions at a controlled distance. The room that was supposed to be our guest room, the overnight bag on the chair, the charger plugged in beside the bed, the second set of keys, not Deja's spare, which had always been kept on the hook by the front door, but a new set, shiny and separate, sitting on the nightstand. She'd been staying there, Simone said, not visiting, staying like it was her room. I said nothing, and when I asked her about it, Simone paused, choosing her word. She got very calm, the way she gets, like she was explaining something to someone who was having trouble keeping up. She said Leonard had asked her to come stay for a while because she'd been going through something in Nashville. She said it had been maybe 3 weeks. Simone looked at her hands. 3 weeks, Mama, you were there every day. I had been there every day for those 3 weeks. I had come home from work every evening, made dinner in that kitchen, watched television with my husband in that living room, slept in our bed 2 doors down from the room where my stepdaughter had apparently been living. I had not known. I had not been told. The thing that lives in the place beneath professional training, beneath the composure my mother built in me and the discipline my career reinforced, that thing went very, very still. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. 3 weeks ago, Simone, why didn't you call me? She turned to look at me, and her eyes filled again, and this time when she spoke, her voice finally cracked. Because it was 3 weeks before my wedding, Mama. Because I didn't know what it meant yet. Because I didn't know if it meant anything, and I didn't want to. She pressed her lips together. I didn't want to hand you something I couldn't take back. There it was. My daughter, 29 years old, 3 weeks from her wedding, had found something in her mother's home that frightened her. And her instinct, her first protective instinct, had been to shield me from it until she was certain. She had gone to her wedding carrying that weight alone. I pulled her back in and held her. Did Deshawn know? I asked over her head. I told him 2 weeks ago, she said. He wanted to tell you immediately. I asked him to wait. I thought about Deshawn Carter in the next room in his post-reception clothes with his unbought sleep eyes, waiting patiently on the other side of that door. I thought about what it means to marry into a family, to love someone so completely that you absorb their complications as your own, that you sit with their mother's pain because your wife asked you to wait, and you honored that. That man, I thought, is exactly who I believed he was. Which meant the question was now about the man I had perhaps been wrong about. There's something else, Simone said. She straightened. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. She reached for the phone on the nightstand, her own phone, her real phone, and she turned the screen toward me. What was on that screen is the thing I have gone over in my mind every day since, because it didn't just change what I thought about Leonard. It changed what I thought about time, about how long a person can be standing right next to you while you look somewhere else entirely. The screenshot on Simone's phone was from an Instagram account I had never seen. The account was private, or it had been, until whoever ran it had apparently made a mistake 3 weeks prior and left it briefly public during a settings change. Simone had been shown it by a college friend who had stumbled across it and, recognizing Deja, had sent the link with a question mark and nothing else. The account had 17 posts. No name in the bio, just a city, Charlotte, North Carolina. A single line underneath, building something beautiful. The photos were of rooms. Our rooms, not explicit, not incriminating in any obvious, immediate way, but unmistakable to anyone who had lived in that house for 11 years. The particular morning light through the kitchen window, the pattern of the living room rug, the view from the back porch toward the garden I had planted myself over the course of a decade. And in several of the photos, at the edge of the frame or reflected in a surface, a figure. Always partial, always cropped just enough to maintain a studied ambiguity. A shoulder, an arm, once a hand resting on the kitchen counter in a way that was somehow, in its very domesticity, the most unsettling image on the page. A man's hand. I knew that hand. I had been looking at that hand across breakfast tables and through car windows and in church pews for 11 years. When were these posted? I asked. My voice was my professional voice now. Neutral, data gathering, the voice I use when I need information before I am entitled to emotion. The oldest one is 14 months ago, Simone said. 14 months. I handed the phone back to her. I stood up. I walked to the window of the bridal suite and looked out at the estate grounds where the early morning was now fully committing to itself, the gray resolving into real light, dew burning off the grass, a groundskeeper moving distantly on a riding mower along the far tree line. 14 months, which meant this, whatever this was, had been accumulating for over a year. Had been taking photographs in my home, my kitchen, my garden, and posting them to a private audience of however many people with the caption, "Building something beautiful," while I came home from work, and made dinner 2 doors down. I thought about every evening of the past 14 months. I ran through them the way you run through a building looking for exits, quickly, with purpose, looking for the moments I had missed. There had been moments, small ones. Leonard coming home later than expected on 3 or 4 occasions and offering explanations that I had accepted without pressure because I am not, by nature, a suspicious woman. Leonard's phone face down on the counter when it had always been face up. A new password on the laptop that he had mentioned casually, something about a work security update, which I had not questioned because I had no reason to question it. I had no reason to question it. That is the thing about being a person who trusts. You don't go looking for exits because you believe the building is sound. And by the time the smoke is visible, the structure has already been compromised in ways you cannot see from where you're standing. "Mama," Simone said from the bed, "what are you going to do?" I turned from the window. My daughter was looking at me with an expression I had seen before. Not fear, exactly, but the particular vulnerability of a child who has just handed an adult the most fragile thing they own and is watching to see how it will be held. She had carried this for 3 weeks alone. She had walked down an aisle carrying it. She had said her vows carrying it. The love I felt for her in that moment was so large it had no edges. First, I said, I'm going to sit down. I sat back down beside her. I took her hand. Then you're going to tell me everything else you know, every detail you have held back. All of it, Simone. I need all of it. She nodded. And then, I said, we are going to think clearly without panic. Because panic helps no one, and we are not panicking women. She almost smiled at that. Almost. And Leonard? She asked. I looked at my daughter's face. This face I had watched form itself from infancy into something so particular and so extraordinary. This face that had trusted me with its hardest truth on the morning of the first day of its new life. Leonard, I said, is going to wait. What Simone told me next, over the following 40 minutes, was detailed and calm and delivered in the precise, architectural way she reserves for things that are too large to survive embellishment. She told me about a conversation she had overheard at the rehearsal dinner. She told me about a phone call she had intercepted, not by intention, but by the ordinary accident of picking up a ringing landline in the kitchen and finding, before she could speak, two voices already in the middle of something. She told me what those voices had said, and when she finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, the groundskeeper's mower had moved to the far end of the property. A bird was insisting on something in the oak trees along the drive. The morning had fully arrived, golden and indifferent and utterly unbothered by what it was illuminating. I sat with all of it for a long moment. 31 years of professional training, 63 years of living, every tool I had ever built or borrowed or been given. And then something happened that I had not expected. Dorothy May knocked on the suite door. Dorothy May Crawford did not come to that door by accident. She had been awake since before me. And what she brought with her, what she had seen with her own eyes late the previous night, after the reception, after the rest of us had gone to our rooms, was the piece that made every other piece lock into place. Dorothy May is 81 years. No, I keep writing that wrong. Dorothy May is 63, same as me, born 4 months later in the same city, though we did not meet until we were both 24 and assigned to the same social services training cohort in Charlotte, and discovered, over terrible vending machine coffee, that we had been living parallel lives in adjacent neighborhoods for our entire childhoods and had simply never intersected until the universe decided it was time. She is the kind of woman who does not make unnecessary movements. She does not call when a text suffices, does not visit when a call suffices, does not knock on hotel suite doors at 7 in the morning without a specific and serious purpose. She came in wearing her travel clothes already, coat over her arm, overnight bag over her shoulder. She had checked out of her cottage. She set the bag down, looked at Simone with an expression of complete unceremonial love, and said, "Baby, I need to speak to your mama alone for 5 minutes. Can you go sit with Deshawn?" Simone looked at me. I nodded. She got up, pressed her lips to my cheek, and left the room. Dorothy May sat where Simone had been sitting. She did not do any of the warming up things, no throat clearing, no preamble. She has known me for 39 years, and she treats my time accordingly. After the reception ended, she said, "I couldn't sleep. You know how I am in unfamiliar beds." I did know. So I walked around the grounds. About midnight, maybe 12:15, I was coming around the path by the East Cottages. The East Cottages, the same East Cottage named in the message on the second phone. Leonard's rental car was parked in front of Cottage 4, Dorothy May said. The light was on inside. I stood there for 2 minutes, maybe 3. She looked at me directly. "Celestine, he didn't come back to your cottage last night." The room did not spin. I want to be clear about that. Everything I have read about moments of large revelation describes a physical vertigo, a loss of orientation. What I felt was almost the opposite, a terrible, clarifying stillness, the sensation of a picture that has been slightly out of focus for a long time suddenly, irrevocably resolving. "What time did you leave the path?" I asked. 12:20. Maybe 12:25. I thought about Leonard in the car with me last night, talking about the band, about Deshawn's cousin's long toast, easy and warm and thoroughly at home in his own skin. I thought about him falling asleep within 20 minutes of returning to the cottage. I thought about how smoothly he had slept, how unbothered his breathing had been while I lay wide-eyed beside him and ran the evidence through my mind. He had not been in the cottage at midnight. He had arrived sometime between 12:20 and whatever time I finally lost consciousness in the early morning hours. And he had slipped into bed beside me and slept the sleep of a man who had resolved something rather than a man who was troubled by it. "Dorothy May," I said, "how long have you suspected?" She held my gaze. This is one of the things I love most about her. She does not look away from the hard questions. 6 months, she said. Maybe 7, small things. Nothing I could bring to you without being certain I was waiting to be certain. 6 months. Simone had known for 3 weeks. Dorothy May had been quietly watchful for 7 months. And I, the trained professional, the reader of rooms and silences and the spaces between words, had been the last to arrive at a truth that had apparently been visible in various degrees to the people around me for the better part of a year. There is a particular humiliation in that. I do not pretend otherwise. But I have sat with enough people in crisis to know that proximity distorts vision, that we are always the worst positioned observers of our own lives because we have the most invested in what we think we see. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I speak to him, I said. I know, said Dorothy May. I need documentation. I need to understand the full shape of this before I put it in front of him, because once I do, the possibility of surprise is gone and he will manage his response. Leonard is a skilled manager of responses. He is, she agreed, so I need to be more prepared than he expects me to be. Dorothy May reached into the front pocket of her overnight bag and produced a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the bed between us without a word. I unfolded it. It was a printed receipt. A restaurant in Nashville. 8 months ago. A table for 2. The credit card number at the bottom was Leonard's. I knew it the way I knew his handwriting, his voice, the particular way he clears his throat before he says something he has rehearsed. A friend of mine runs the place, Dorothy May said. She sent it to me when I asked, without asking why. Some women know when not to ask why. I refolded the receipt. I held it for a moment. Then I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and looked out the window one final time at the September morning, golden, unhurried, entirely indifferent to what it was witnessing. I had come to this estate for my daughter's wedding. I had intended to leave it with nothing but joy, nothing but the warm, lasting satisfaction of having watched Simone begin her life. Instead, I was leaving it with a receipt, a screenshot, a second-hand account of a midnight car parked in front of a lit cottage, and the specific, settled clarity of a woman who has finally stopped negotiating with what she knows. Leonard was going to have to answer for this. Not today. Not in this place, not on these grounds, not while Simone and Deshawn were still here, but soon, fully, on terms entirely of my own choosing. And the first thing I needed to do when I got home to Charlotte was find out who else had a key to my house. I drove home from that estate with my husband in the passenger seat, talking about the weather, about how well everything had gone, about whether Simone and Deshawn had decided on a honeymoon destination yet. And the whole time, I had that receipt in my coat pocket and a question in my mind that would not wait much longer for its answer. How many people knew, and how many had decided that their comfort was worth more than my right to the truth? Home looks different when you return to it with new eyes. I have heard people say that in sessions, in support groups, in the quiet aftermath of disclosures that rearrange the furniture of a life. I have said it myself in my professional voice to other women sitting across from me in my office. When you come back to a place knowing what you now know, the place reveals itself differently. I said it as though it were a manageable clinical truth, a thing that happens to other people and can be processed with the right tools. I understood, pulling into our driveway on that Sunday afternoon, that I had been insufficiently humble about what I was describing. The house on Pemberton Circle in Charlotte, the house Leonard and I had bought together 8 years into our marriage, a 4-bedroom colonial with a garden I had built from bare earth and a kitchen I had renovated myself, choosing every tile and cabinet pull with the particular care of a woman who intends to grow old somewhere, looked exactly as I had left it. Brick front, black shutters, the rose bushes I had planted along the front walk still carrying a few late-season blooms. It looked exactly the same, and it felt entirely foreign. Leonard carried the bags in. He moved through the house the way he always did on returns from travel, efficiently, noting what needed attention, opening windows, checking the mail. He kissed me on the cheek in the kitchen and said he was going to shower and change, and then he thought maybe we could order dinner rather than cook, given the long weekend. Of course, I said. I waited until I heard the shower running. Then I moved through the house with the systematic attention of someone conducting a welfare check, which, in a manner of speaking, I was. My own home, my own welfare. I went to the guest room first. The bed was made. The room smelled faintly of the same unfamiliar perfume I had noticed on Deja the morning of the wedding, something expensive and particular, something that did not belong among the lavender sachets and cedar blocks I maintained in every closet of this house. I opened the closet. 3 wire hangers. One of them had a slight depression at the bar, the kind a heavier garment leaves when it hangs for weeks. I opened the nightstand drawer. Empty. But recently emptied, there was a faint ring on the wood interior, the kind left by a glass or a small canister, circular and definitive. I stood in the guest room of my own home and understood, in the specific physical way that a room communicates when words have failed, that my stepdaughter had been living here. Recently, perhaps until the wedding weekend, when she had been required to maintain the fiction of being a visitor arriving from Nashville. I went to the kitchen next. There is a junk drawer in my kitchen. Every house has one, where we keep takeout menus, loose batteries, rubber bands, and the accumulated small detritus of domestic life. I've never found the junk drawer interesting enough to fully organize. I opened it now. Under a folded takeout menu and 3 dead batteries, I found a key. Not our spare house key that is on the hook by the back door on the labeled ring I've maintained for years. This was a separate key, loose, with a small piece of blue painter's tape wrapped around the bow and a single initial written on the tape in black marker. D, a key with an initial, in my own kitchen drawer. And the thing that made it worse than the key itself was the tape, the careful, permanent little piece of tape with her initial, like she had made herself at home enough to label it, like she had planned to stay. I held that key for a long moment before I put it back exactly where I had found it. Not because I intended to leave it there indefinitely, because I had learned over 31 years that evidence disturbed is evidence compromised, and I was not ready to compromise anything yet. I was still in the building phase, the slow, careful accumulation of a picture complete enough to be undeniable. What I had so far, a restaurant receipt from 8 months ago, purchased on Leonard's card for a table for two in Nashville, a screenshot of a private Instagram account featuring photographs taken inside my home, a key with Deja's initial in my kitchen junk drawer, Dorothy May's account of Leonard's car outside Cottage 4 at midnight, the message on the second phone, "Don't let her ruin it," and Simone's overheard phone call. I had not yet allowed myself to fully sit with what Simone had described to me in that bridal suite, what she had heard on the kitchen landline 2 weeks before the wedding. I had filed it away with the professional's reflex of not yet, not until I have more context. But sitting now in my kitchen with that key between my fingers, I let the file open. She had picked up the landline to call the florist. Leonard's voice was already on the line. He must have dialed from the bedroom extension without checking whether the kitchen phone would click. The call was already in progress. She had covered the receiver before she breathed. She had heard Deja say, "She's not going to understand. You know that." She had heard Leonard say, "She doesn't have to understand yet. She just has to not know yet. There's a difference." And then, after a pause that Simone described as the kind of quiet that has a shape to it, like it was holding something. "I'm handling it, Deja. Trust me. After the wedding is done, I'm handling it." I put the key back under the takeout menu. I closed the junk drawer. Leonard was still in the shower. I could hear the water running, the ordinary domestic sound of it, the completely unremarkable sound of a man who has been showering in this house for 8 years and sees no reason to alter the routine. I went to my bedroom. I sat in the chair by the window. The reading chair, the one where I keep my current book and the lamp angled just right, and the small table beside it with the coaster from Simone's first apartment, which she gave me when she moved out because she knew I liked it. I sat in my chair and I looked at my room. 11 years of marriage, 8 years in this house, the quilt on the bed that I had bought in Asheville on our 5th anniversary, the frame photographs on the dresser, our wedding photo, a picture of Simone at her Spelman graduation, one of Leonard and me at the beach in South Carolina 3 summers ago, both of us laughing at something I can't recall, looking like people who believed entirely in the life they were standing inside. I asked myself the question I had been deferring since the coat room at Harvest House. What is this precisely? Not the procedural question, the emotional one. Not what is happening, but what does it mean in the full human weight of that word? What does it mean that a man who has been your fixed point, your chosen person, the one you told yourself you had chosen better this time, what does it mean that he has been conducting a secret life in your kitchen, in your guest room, in restaurants in Nashville, with a 21-year-old woman who happens to be the daughter he raised, and who calls him by name and not by title, and who labels her house key with her initial because she has made herself so comfortable in the architecture of your life that she has stopped even trying to be invisible? What does it mean? I sat with that question the way I sit with the hard ones, without rushing it toward an answer, without forcing a conclusion before the thinking is finished. The shower stopped. I heard the bathroom door, the closet, the specific creak of the bedroom floorboard, 2 steps from the door that has been creaking for 4 years and that Leonard has promised 4 times to fix. He appeared in the doorway in fresh clothes, toweling his hair. "You want Thai or Italian?" he asked. I looked at him. Leonard Monroe, 58 years old, silver at the temples, standing in the doorway of our bedroom asking about takeout food with the absolute unruffled ease of a man who has no idea that the world he has built has just developed a crack from the foundation up. "Thai," I said. He smiled. "Thai it is." He disappeared back toward the kitchen. I reached for my phone and sent Dorothy May a message. "I'm home. Found the key." Beginning quietly. Her reply came in 40 seconds. "I'm here. Call whenever." I put the phone down. I looked out the window at my garden, the rose bushes I had planted, the raised beds I had built with my own hands, the small iron bench under the dogwood tree where I sometimes sat on Sunday mornings with my coffee when the season was right. Building something beautiful, the Instagram bio had said. I had already built something beautiful. And somewhere along the way, without my knowledge or consent, it had been borrowed for a different story entirely. That evening, I sat across from Leonard at our kitchen table and watched him eat Thai food and talk about the wedding and mention, casually, between bites, that Deja had texted to say she'd gotten back to Nashville safely. He said it like a piece of ordinary news. And I watched his face when he said her name, and I learned something important about Leonard Monroe that I had not known before. He had a face for her name, not a guilty face, not the tightening, the fractional look away that people imagine when they imagine someone concealing something. Leonard is more skilled than that, and I think I had always known somewhere that he was skilled in this way without having occasion to test the knowledge. No. What he had was a softening, a nearly imperceptible relaxation around the eyes, a warmth, an ease, as though the name itself was a small pleasure he had permitted himself in public because he had calculated that no one was watching closely enough to notice. I noticed. I said, "I'm glad she got back safe," and went on eating. The days that followed were among the strangest of my life. Stranger in some ways than the days that came after the confrontation, because those days at least had the clarity of open conflict. These days were the days of pretending, of moving through the house and the routine and the ordinary language of marriage while conducting, in the quieter part of my mind, a parallel investigation that grew more detailed and more damaging with every new piece of information. I am not proud of what I did next. I want to be honest about that. I am not proud, but I am not sorry because I had been the last person in my own life to know the truth, and I was not willing to be surprised again. I went to Leonard's home office on a Tuesday afternoon while he was at a client meeting. Leonard is a financial consultant. He works with small businesses and private clients, mostly self-employed professionals, and his office is the second bedroom at the back of the house, lined with files and binders and the organized, color-coded accumulation of decades of careful work. He keeps it locked when he is not in it. He has always kept it locked. I had accepted this as a professional habit, a preference for clean separation between work and home, and I had never questioned it. I had a copy of the key. It had been made 7 years ago when we first moved in case of emergency, and kept in my top dresser drawer in a small ceramic dish that holds the items I do not use regularly but cannot discard. I used it. Inside, the office was neat. That is Leonard's genius, and I say that without affection in this particular context. He is a man of exceptional neatness, which means that evidence of disorder in a neat man's space is always meaningful. The disorder I found was small, Easy to miss. A second email address printed on a routing confirmation that had been tucked inside a manila folder labeled miscellaneous correspondence. The email address was a string of numbers and letters, the kind people create when they do not want to be found. The routing confirmation was for a bank account, not our joint account, not his individual checking account, both of which I was familiar with. A third account at a bank we did not use, with a balance I could not see on the printed page, but that had received a transfer of $600 the previous month. A small wooden box on the top shelf behind a row of binders that contained, when I opened it, 4 photographs, printed on regular paper, slightly faded from what appeared to be older printing. All 4 photographs were of Deja at various ages, which alone would not have been notable, but in all 4 photographs she was in our house. Not the Nashville apartment she supposedly lived in, this house. The kitchen, the garden, the back porch. And in one of them, visible in the background on the kitchen counter, was a coffee mug I had bought from a ceramicist at the farmer's market the previous spring. It was a mug I had purchased approximately 7 months ago, which meant that photograph was at most 7 months old. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I locked the office door. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea from the very same ceramicist's mug and stood at the window looking at my garden, and I gave myself 5 minutes. 5 minutes to feel what I was feeling, the full force of it, undiluted, without the professional management that I had been applying to it since the coat room at Harvest House. 5 minutes of the real thing, the grief, the fury, the profound, disorienting sense of having been made a fool of by someone I had chosen to trust in the specific, deliberate way that people choose trust when they have been careful about it. The timer on my phone went off. I finished my tea. I called my attorney. Her name is Vivian Grace Holloway. Not a friend, not a confidant, but a professional I had retained once, years before, and never unretained because my mother always said, keep your doctor, keep your lawyer, keep your hairdresser, and you will never be truly without resources. I called Vivian and I said, I need a consultation, not urgent, discreet. And I need to know what I own and what I'm entitled to before I have a conversation I cannot take back. Vivian Grace Holloway met me for coffee at a small place off Independence Boulevard on a Thursday morning. Neutral territory, nothing that Leonard frequented. A neighborhood bakery with good light and bad parking that kept it comfortably unbusy on weekday mornings. She was 60, sharp-eyed with natural locks and the unhurried manner of a woman who has sat with more complicated family situations than most people will ever encounter, and who has learned to receive them without the flinching that makes clients feel worse than the situation itself. I told her everything, not as a client tells a story, not with the emotional weighting, the emphasis in the wrong places, the small self-justifications that creep in when pain is recent. I told it the way I would have told it about someone else, chronologically, specifically, with the evidence itemized and the speculation clearly labeled as such. Vivian listened without interrupting. When I finished, she turned her coffee cup in a slow circle and said, "How are you sleeping?" 4 hours, I said, maybe 5. That's going to need to improve, she said. You're going to need your full capacity for this. I know. All right. She opened her notepad. Walk me back through the financial piece. We spent an hour on the practical architecture of what I was facing. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Marital property is divided fairly, though not necessarily equally, based on circumstances the court weighs. The house was jointly titled. The retirement accounts were separate. The joint savings account into which I had deposited a portion of my salary every month for 11 years was accessible to both of us. Vivian advised me, calmly and without drama, to photograph all financial documents currently accessible to me, to create a separate, secure email account for our communications, to make no large financial moves yet, nothing that would signal awareness, but to understand precisely what the landscape looked like. "You're not ready to confront him yet," she said. It was not a question. "Not yet. I need more of the picture." She nodded. "Then build it methodically. Don't move until you're ready to move completely." She looked at me over her coffee cup. "You understand that once you start this, it has a momentum of its own." "I understand that better than most people," I said. "I know you do. That's why I'm not worried about you." She allowed herself a small, dry smile. "I am, however, going to advise you to find someone to talk to. Not me. A therapist. Someone whose only job is to be on your side without any practical stake in the outcome." I thought about Dorothy May, who had been texting me every morning since Sunday with nothing but the word here. A single word, a daily check, a reminder of presence. "I have someone," I said. "Good." She closed her notepad. "Then let's meet again in 2 weeks. Bring copies of whatever you find." I drove home from that coffee meeting along the familiar streets of my neighborhood, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning of the wedding. Not peace. Peace was a long way off, and I was clear-eyed enough not to pretend otherwise. But something in the vicinity of agency. The particular grounded sensation of a woman who has stopped being acted upon and has begun carefully and deliberately to act. There were things I did not yet know. There were answers I had not yet extracted. There were conversations ahead of me that would require everything I had, and possibly more than I thought I had. But I was 63 years old, and I had built things from nothing before. I had rebuilt things after they broke. I had sat across from the worst that people do to each other and found in the rubble the thread that leads towards something worth keeping. I knew how to do this. What I did not know, what I could not have anticipated pulling into my driveway that Thursday afternoon, was that Leonard had been home all morning, and that he was standing in the kitchen when I walked in, with his phone on the counter in front of him, face up. And that on the screen, visible from where I stopped in the doorway, was a message from Deja that read, "I think she knows." Leonard looked up. He looked at my face, and I watched him understand in real time that he was right. He said my name, just my name, Celestine, in a voice I had never heard from him before. Not guilty, not apologetic, something else entirely. Something that told me the conversation I had been preparing for had just arrived 4 days before I was ready for it. And what he said next was not what I expected. Not even close. He said my name the way you say a word when you have just realized it means something different than you thought. Celestine. Not loud, not defensive, the way a man says a name when the ground has shifted and he is trying to find his footing on the new surface. Carefully, without sudden movements. The way you walk when you are not sure what will hold your weight. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and looked at my husband, and I did not move. The phone on the counter between us, face up, screen still lit, Deja's message still visible from where I stood, was the most honest thing in the room. Everything else was performance and negotiation, and the elaborate human machinery of people who've been caught doing something they cannot justify. But that phone, that message, I think she knows. That was the truth arriving without ornament. I set my purse down on the entry table. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook by the door. My hook, the one I have used for 8 years. The one Leonard has always teased me about because I will not hang my coat on any other hook no matter how full that one gets. I did all of this with the deliberateness of a woman who is deciding in real time what kind of woman she is going to be in this moment. Then I walked into the kitchen and I sat down at the table. "Sit down, Leonard," I said. He sat. I looked at him for a long moment. The full, undeflected look that I had been withholding since the coat room at Harvest House, since the morning in the bridal suite, since every measured, professional moment in which I had chosen patience over confrontation. I let myself look at him completely without the buffer of management, and I took inventory of what I saw. He was afraid. Not the fear of a man who has been caught doing something shameful. The fear of a man who is watching something he has built, carefully over time in parallel to another life, begin to come apart. The fear is different. It has less guilt in it and more calculation. I recognized it because I had sat across from it before, in my office, in clients who had come not because they wanted help, but because the situation had forced their hand. "How long?" I said. He looked at his hands. "Celestine." "How long, Leonard?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked twice and went silent. The refrigerator made its low, steady hum that I have stopped hearing over the years, the way you stop hearing the clock on the wall, until suddenly, in the wrong kind of quiet, it is the loudest thing in the room. 2 years, he said. 2 years. I held that number in my mind and I let it do what it needed to do. 2 years ago, I had been sitting in this kitchen. I had been going to work, coming home, cooking dinner, sleeping in our bed. I had been planning Simone's bridal shower. I had been alive inside my life, completely and without suspicion, while 2 years of something else was being constructed around me like scaffolding around a building I thought I owned. 2 years, I said. My voice was level. I want you to understand that. It was level, not because I was not feeling what I was feeling, but because I had decided in the space between the doorway and the table that I was not going to give Leonard Monroe the gift of my collapse. Tell me what that means. All of it. No management, no version. The truth. He told me, I will not repeat all of it here because some of it belongs only to that kitchen, to that afternoon, to the small, terrible intimacy of 2 people dismantling 11 years of marriage over a table where they have eaten 1,000 ordinary meals. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape matters. Deja had come to visit 18 months ago, not 21 months, as I had believed from the Instagram account, so the account predated the visit, which told me something about the sequence I had been assembling incorrectly. She had come for a long weekend. She had missed a return flight deliberately, and Leonard had let her stay without telling me, had told me instead that she had extended her visit because of a project she was working on. I remembered that visit. I remembered being pleased that she and Leonard were spending time together. I remembered thinking that Deja was softening, that she and I might finally be building something more genuine than the polite, careful surface we had maintained for years. I had been glad. That specific memory, the gladness, was the hardest thing Leonard said to me that afternoon, and he didn't even say it. It was just there between his words, a consequence. 2 years. And in those 2 years, I had been glad. I had told Dorothy May over lunch that I thought things with Deja were improving. I had told Simone that sometimes families just take time. I had believed, with the faith of a woman who wants things to be whole, that what I was witnessing was healing. Not the opposite of healing, not the thing it actually was. Leonard talked for a long time. I listened the way I have trained myself to listen, fully, without interruption, without the interjections that redirect a speaker toward what the listener wants to hear rather than what the speaker actually has to say. I gave him the silence that a full account requires, and he filled it, and I learned things that I had not known, things that arrived in layers, each one requiring a moment of adjustment before the next. The Nashville apartment was real. Deja did live there, did have her music work there, was not entirely a fiction, but Nashville and Charlotte had been maintained in parallel. The apartment a home base, this house a second life that had grown increasingly primary over the course of 18 months. The second phone was Leonard's, not Deja's. He had bought it 14 months ago. He used it exclusively for communication he did not want, documented on his regular phone or accessible through the account linked to our shared tablet. The bank account I had found the routing confirmation for, the one with the separate transfers, had received approximately $4,000 over the past 10 months. Music equipment, Leonard said. Things Deja needed for her work. Things he had wanted to help with outside the visibility of our joint finances. $4,000 quietly moved over 10 months to fund a life being built on the other side of mine. I thought about Vivian Grace Holloway's advice. Understand precisely what the landscape looks like. I was understanding it now. When Leonard finally stopped talking, the kitchen had gone from afternoon light to the softer, amber light of early evening. I had not moved from my chair. I had not poured water, had not reached for anything, had not allowed the practical management of physical comfort to interrupt what was happening in this room. I looked at my husband. You said after the wedding you were going to handle it, I said. What did handle it mean? He looked at me for a long moment. The calculation in his face was very visible now. He had stopped performing ease, had dropped the management, and what remained was the naked arithmetic of a man deciding what version of the truth costs him least. I was going to tell you, he said. Tell me what, specifically? Another pause. That I thought we should consider. He stopped, started again. Celestine, what Deja and I... Do not, I said, finish that sentence with the word love. He closed his mouth. I leaned forward slightly. Because I have been a social worker for 31 years, Leonard, and I know what the word love is used to do when it is placed in a sentence like the one you were about to speak. It is used to elevate, to make the speaker feel less accountable for the consequence of what they've done, by framing it as something that happened to them rather than something they chose, repeatedly, over 2 years, in my house, with my family, while I was in the next room being glad that things were getting better. Silence. So I'm asking you again, I said, when you told Deja you were going to handle it after the wedding, what did handle it mean? He looked at the table. I was going to ask you for a divorce. There it is. I had known it was coming. Had known, in the way the body knows things before the mind has finished working, that the shape of this story had always included that word. But hearing it spoken in my kitchen, in Leonard's voice, with the autumn light slanting through the window, I had stood at 100 times, made it real in a way that no amount of anticipation can fully prepare you for. I said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, "How long have you been planning that?" About 6 months. 6 months. The same window Dorothy May had described, the same 7 months of small observations, the barely visible evidence of a man who had made a decision and was working toward it on a timeline I had not been informed of. He had decided 6 months ago that this marriage was ending. And for 6 months he had continued to sleep beside me, eat at this table, take my hand in church, and plan a secret financial account, and a second phone and a version of the future that had no place for me in it. I stood up. I was surprised, actually, by how clearly I could move, by the fact that my legs held me without effort, and my hands were steady at my sides, and my breathing was, if not calm, at least controlled. I had wondered, in the weeks of preparation, what this moment would do to my body. What I found was that the body, when it has been preparing for a blow, even without conscious acknowledgement, absorbs the impact differently than it absorbs a surprise. I was not surprised. I walked to the window and looked at my garden in the evening light, and I gave myself 10 seconds to feel the full weight of what I was feeling. The grief, the fury, the profound disorientation of loving someone and being so profoundly wrong about them. And then I turned back to the room. "You need to leave tonight," I said. He looked up. "Not permanently, not yet. That conversation requires my attorney and a great deal more than this evening. But tonight you are not sleeping in this house. You will go to a hotel, or you will call your sister in Charlotte, or you will make whatever arrangement suits you. But you will not be here when I wake up tomorrow morning." He started to say something. "Leonard." My voice did not rise. It went lower, which is the direction my voice has always gone when I mean something entirely. I spent 31 years helping people find their way through the worst moments of their lives. I know exactly what the next weeks are going to require. And one of the things they are going to require is that I have the space to be exactly as broken as I need to be without performing stability for your benefit. So you are going to leave tonight. He left within the hour. He packed a bag with the careful efficiency of a man who has been somewhere in the back of his mind half expecting to do exactly this. And the fact that the packing was efficient, unhesitating, practiced, told me something about that 6-month timeline that no spoken word had managed to communicate as clearly. The house after he left was the loudest silence I have ever inhabited. I know that sounds contradictory, but anyone who has lived with another person for 11 years and then stood alone in the rooms they shared will understand immediately. The house was full of the specific accusatory presence of absence, the particular quiet of a space that is used to a second set of sounds and is now registering their removal the way the body registers the removal of a splinter. Not with relief initially, but with a raw, exposed awareness of the place where something was lodged. I called Dorothy May. She was at my door in 40 minutes. She didn't ask questions when I opened it. She just came in the way she has been coming into spaces where I need her for 39 years, set her bag down, went to the kitchen, and made tea. Not coffee, not anything that required decision-making. Tea, because tea is the thing you make for someone when you want them to know that you intend to stay a while and you are not in a hurry. I sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything Leonard had said, in order, in the same precise architectural way I had told it to Vivian Grace. And Dorothy May sat across from me and listened in the same way she has always listened, with her full attention, with the particular quality of presence that is her greatest gift, the ability to hold space without filling it. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" Not "what are you going to do?" Not "I can't believe him." Not any of the reflexive responses that would have been about her own reaction to the information rather than my experience of it. How do you feel? I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Like a building that has had its foundation examined, I said, and found to be standing. Damaged, but standing. Dorothy May nodded, and underneath that, I said more quietly, like a woman who spent 31 years helping other people see their lives clearly and managed. That's not a professional failure, Dorothy May said. That's being human. I know that doesn't make it easier to hold. No, she agreed, it doesn't. We sat with that for a while. The tea cooled. The house settled around us with its old building sounds, the creak of the floors, the tick of the heating system coming on in the autumn evening. And outside my garden held its shapes in the dark, the iron bench under the dogwood tree, a shadow I could just make out through the kitchen window. I thought about Simone. I had called her from the car. That morning she had wept in the bridal suite, and I had said, "Your job right now is to go be married. I am handling this." She had pushed back. She had wanted to come home immediately. I had been firm, gently but completely firm, because I knew, with everything I knew about the mechanics of family crisis, that allowing my daughter to sacrifice the beginning of her marriage to manage her mother's was not something I was willing to accept. She had texted me every day since. Single lines. "I'm here. Tell me what you need." I had responded with what I actually needed, which was for her to be happy and present in her new life, and to trust that I was capable of managing what was mine to manage. Now I sent her a message. "He's gone for tonight. I'm okay. Dorothy May is here. Don't worry." Her reply came in 2 minutes. "I love you, Mama. You raised me to watch how you handle hard things. I'm watching." I set the phone down. Something in my chest shifted, moved slightly like a stone finding a new placement in riverbed, not lighter, not heavier, just differently settled. My daughter was watching how I handled hard things. She had always been watching. Since she was 4 years old, falling asleep in my lap, since she was stretching the kitchen phone cord around the corner, since she was walking down an aisle with a secret folded inside her heart to protect me. She'd been watching how I moved through this world, and she had been learning from it, building herself from it, the way all children build themselves from their mothers, whether either party intends it or not. I thought about what I wanted her to learn from this. Not the grief. She would inherit enough grief in her own life without borrowing mine. Not the fury, useful as it had been, and would continue to be as fuel. Something more durable than either. Something she could carry into her own marriage, her own hard chapters, her own moments of standing in a doorway, deciding what kind of woman to be. I wanted her to learn that dignity is not the absence of pain, that clarity is more useful than speed, that a woman who knows what she owns cannot truly be dispossessed, only inconvenienced. "Dorothy May," I said. She looked up. "I'm going to be all right." She looked at me for a long, steady moment. Then she said, "I know I've always known. I was just waiting for you to catch up." Grief is strange. It does not move in one direction. That night, after Dorothy May left, I sat alone in my house for the first time in 8 years, and I cried for the marriage I had believed in. Not for Leonard, not entirely. For the version of myself that had trusted so completely. For the years that had been real, even if the foundation underneath them was not. And somewhere in the middle of that grief, something else arrived, something I did not expect, something that felt dangerously close to relief. 3 days after Leonard left, Deja called me. I had been expecting it. What I had not been certain of was the timing or the register, whether she would come with contrition or with the compressed, watchful energy she had always carried in my presence, that quality of a person who has decided the rules of a room and is waiting to see whether you will accept their version. She called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in the garden cutting back the late season rose bushes, which is work that requires attention and gives the mind something physical to organize itself around. I looked at the name on my phone screen and I set down my clippers and I answered. Celestine, she said. Deja. A pause. Then, I want to talk to you, not by phone. Can I come to Charlotte? I looked at my rose bushes, half cut, the clippers in my gloved hand. I thought about what I wanted from this conversation, not what I was owed, not what would feel satisfying, but what would actually serve the future I was building. Yes, I said, come Friday. She came on Friday. She was not the Deja of the wedding, not the wine red dress version, not the compressed energy, not the studied ambiguity I had spent years interpreting incorrectly. She came in jeans and a plain sweater, her hair simply pulled back, and she looked younger than 21, which is the thing that happened to my fury when I opened the front door and saw her standing on the step of the house, whose key she had labeled with her initial. It did not dissolve, but it had to make room for something more complicated. I brought her into the living room. I did not bring her into the kitchen because the kitchen was still too close to the night Leonard had packed his bag, and I needed the living room's more formal distance. She sat across from me, and she did not perform anything. That, I will say, was what I had not expected, that she would come without armor. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on mine, and she said without preamble, I want you to know that I knew it was wrong. I want you to know that I told him that. More than once. I said nothing. I waited. She stopped, reorganized. He's very good at making things seem like they have a logic, a justification. You've been married to him, you know that. I do, I said. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. I came because I thought you deserved to hear it directly from me. Not through him, not through whatever he's told you. Directly. I looked at this young woman, 21 years old, born to a mother who had died when she was 7, raised by a father who had apparently decided that she was something other than a daughter, brought into my family and into my home. And I felt the thing I had been resisting feeling since the coat room at Harvest House. Not hatred, not contempt, something sadder and more complicated than either. Deja, I said, I have something I need to ask you, and I need you to answer me honestly. She held my gaze. All right. Did you ever, at any point in the last 2 years, think about what this would cost Simone? The question landed. I watched it land. Watched something move across her face that was not calculation and not performance. Something real, something that came from a place she had not been ready to access when she walked through my door. She pressed her lips together. Yes, she said, toward the end, especially. When the wedding was coming. She looked down briefly, then back up. It's the thing I'm going to carry the longest. I believed her. Not because the answer was perfect or because it resolved anything, because it was the first thing she had said to me in 11 years that I could feel the weight of truth in. The full, unmanaged weight of it. We sat in that living room for 2 hours. I will not share all of it. Some of it belongs to those two chairs, to that afternoon, to the particular species of conversation that can only happen between two women who have both been shaped and harmed by the same person and are trying carefully to figure out which parts of what remains can be rebuilt and which must simply be grieved. What I will share is this: I did not forgive her that afternoon. Forgiveness is not a decision made in a single conversation. It is a practice, a long and effortful and completely nonlinear practice, and anyone who tells you differently is selling a version of it that has never been tested by real weight. What I did that afternoon was something smaller and more honest. I saw her as a person, separate from what she had done, as a 21-year-old woman who had grown up without her mother in a household with a man who had not maintained the boundaries he should have maintained. That is not absolution. That is simply clarity. And clarity, I have come to understand, is the thing I was built for. When she left, I stood on my front porch and watched her car pull out of the driveway and down Pemberton Circle. And I stayed there for a few minutes in the October air, my arms folded, the neighborhood doing its ordinary weekday afternoon things around me, a child on a bicycle, a dog on a leash, the school bus turning at the end of the block. I looked at my rose bushes, still half cut from Wednesday. I went inside. I got my clippers. I went back to the garden, and I finished the job. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do in the middle of her life coming apart is finish what she started. The garden doesn't know what happened in the house. The roses don't care about the receipts or the second phone or the key in the junk drawer. They just need what they've always needed. And there is something clarifying about that. Something that brings you back to the part of yourself that cannot be involved in anyone else's choices. The part that is simply and completely yours. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. Not because Leonard had filed. Leonard had not yet filed anything, had been living in an extended stay hotel off Independence Boulevard for 6 weeks, calling me every few days with the careful, tentative quality of a man who has not yet decided whether to fight for something or simply let it conclude. The papers arrived because I had filed, because Vivian Grace Holloway had been thorough and precise and had moved with exactly the momentum I had asked her to move with, and because I had decided in the garden with my clippers on that October afternoon that waiting for Leonard to define the timeline of the rest of my life was not something I was prepared to do. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and I made coffee before I opened it. This is something my mother taught me without intending to. The practice of completing a small, ordinary act before approaching a large, extraordinary one. She would fold a dish towel or water a plant or straighten something on the counter before she opened the bills, before she made the hard phone calls, before she delivered the news that nobody wanted to hear. I always thought it was anxiety management. I understand now that it was sovereignty, the insistence on performing one act of your own ordinary life before someone else's crisis is permitted to take the room. I made coffee. I opened the envelope. The language of legal documents is deliberately unromantic, which is, I have come to think, one of its few mercies. There is no room in a petition for dissolution of marriage for the specific texture of what is being dissolved, the 11 years of breakfast tables and Sunday services and arguments about the thermostat and the particular way a person's breathing changes over a decade until you can read their sleep the way you read a familiar book. The document does not know about any of that. It knows about property and accounts and the legal dissolution of a contractual arrangement, and it executes its knowledge with the brisk neutrality of a thing that has never loved anyone. I read every page. Then I signed where Vivian had marked, and I put the papers back in the envelope, and I set the envelope by my purse to be returned to Vivian's office. And I sat with my coffee and looked at my garden through the kitchen window. The rose bushes were cut back properly now, the way they needed to be for winter. Severe and necessary, the kind of pruning that looks like damage until the spring comes and the new growth proves that the cutting was care. The iron bench under the dogwood tree was empty. A few late leaves moved in the November air. I thought about the woman who had planted this garden. She had planted it with the belief that she was building something permanent, something rooted, something that would outlast the immediate weather of any given season. She had been right about the garden. She had been wrong about what she thought the garden was part of. But here is what I want you to understand, and what I did not fully understand until I sat in that kitchen on that Tuesday morning with those papers signed. The garden was still the garden. It had not been retroactively changed by what happened in the house. The decade of work, the accumulated knowledge of what grew where and needed what, the specific satisfaction of a thing tended over time, none of that had been taken from me. It existed in my hands, in my body, in the practiced competence of a woman who had shown up for something faithfully for years. That was mine. No receipt, no second phone, no key with an initial, no midnight light in a cottage window, and none of it could reach into my hands and remove what I had built there. My phone buzzed. Simone. Mama. Deshawn got a work call this morning from Charlotte. We're thinking about coming home for Thanksgiving. Can I call you tonight? I smiled at my phone. A real smile, unrehearsed, the kind that happens before you've decided to produce it. Call me anytime, I wrote back. I'll be here. There is a version of this story where I tell you I was fine from that moment forward, that the papers restored something, that the signing was cathartic, that I walked out of grief the way you walk out of a room. That version would be easier to tell and easier to hear, but it would not be true. And the only thing I have ever had that Leonard Monroe cannot claim any portion of is my commitment to the truth. The weeks that followed the filing were not the clean, forward-moving weeks I had imagined during the planning phase. Grief does not honor plans. This is something I have told clients for 3 decades in the patient voice of a professional who understands the theory thoroughly. I told myself in November what I have told others, and I found, as I have always suspected but never fully experienced from this side of the table, that knowing the theory changes almost nothing about the lived experience of the thing itself. I cried in unexpected places. In the cereal aisle of the grocery store, holding a brand that Leonard preferred and that I had been buying for 8 years without thinking about it. In the parking lot of my church on a Sunday morning, unable for a full 5 minutes to make myself go inside. In the garden twice, not planned. Not the productive grief of a woman doing her work, but the sudden ambushing kind that arrives without warning and takes what it needs before it lets you go. I let it. That was the discipline of those weeks, not the discipline of holding it together, but the discipline of permitting the falling apart to happen on its own schedule, within its own logic, without trying to accelerate or suppress it. 31 years had taught me that suppressed grief finds alternative routes, and I did not have the energy to manage alternative routes. Dorothy May called every morning. Not long calls, sometimes just 5 minutes, sometimes 20. She told me about her own life, her grandchildren, her garden, her ongoing renovation of the bathroom she had been renovating, with characteristic deliberateness. For approximately 3 years, She talked to me the way you talk to someone who needs to hear that the ordinary world is continuing, that there are bathrooms being renovated and grandchildren doing unremarkable, wonderful things, and gardens that need attention, regardless of the condition of the interior life of the person looking at them. I saw my therapist every Thursday. Her name was Dr. Renata Osei, 45, Ghanaian American, with an office in South Charlotte that smelled of cedar and had no clock visible from the client chair, which I had always considered a thoughtful professional decision. She received everything I brought her with the same steady, unflappable attention, and she asked the questions that pushed gently on the places I was inclined to armor over. "You keep describing what you did," she said to me one Thursday in late November. "How you moved, how you gathered information, how you acted. You describe it very precisely." "I'm a precise person," I said. "You are," she agreed. "What I notice is that you describe the architecture of your response very clearly, and you're less available to talk about the feeling underneath the architecture." I sat with that. The feeling underneath, I said, is harder to be precise about. "Yes," she said, "that's often true for the most important feelings." She folded her hands. "What was the feeling, Celestine? Not what you did about it. The feeling itself." I looked at the cedar-scented wall and I thought about the coat room at Harvest House. I thought about the moment I read that message on the second phone. Not what I decided afterward. The decision had been clean and purposeful, and I could describe it clearly. The moment before the decision. The first unmanaged second of knowing. "Erased," I said. The word surprised me when it came out, but it was right. "Tell me more," Dr. Osei said. Like I worked for the language, like the past 11 years had been a document I believed in, that I contributed to, that had my name at the top. And I found out that there was a second document running simultaneously, and the second document was the one that was real. And the first one, the one I was living in, was the version that got filed in the cabinet and forgotten about. I paused. "Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" "I understand exactly," she said, "and I want to ask you, do you believe that?" "Believe what?" "That the first document wasn't real." I opened my mouth, closed it. "The 11 years," she said, "the marriage you lived, the home you built, the relationship with Simone, with Dorothy May, with your community and your work in your garden." She held my gaze. "Leonard's choices don't retroactively determine whether those things were real, Celestine. They determine what he was willing to protect. Those are different questions." I sat with that for the rest of the session and most of the drive home. It was, I think, the most important thing anyone said to me in all the months that followed. Not because it resolved the grief. It didn't. But because it drew a line between what had been taken and what was still mine, and that line, once visible, proved more durable than I had believed possible. A month after I filed, Leonard called me on a Sunday evening and asked if we could talk. Not about the legal proceedings, not about the house, but simply talk, the way we had talked before everything. I sat with that request for a long time before I answered. What I told him and what he said back changed something I had been holding since the coat room. Not everything, but something. I told Leonard we could talk. Not because I owed him the conversation. I was under no obligation, legal or moral, to give my soon-to-be ex-husband access to my Sunday evenings or my careful emotional reserves. I told him we could talk, because Dr. Osei had helped me understand that there were things I needed to say that had nothing to do with him receiving them, and because Vivian had confirmed that a single personal conversation carefully maintained, would not affect the legal proceedings. And because, if I am honest, and I have committed to honesty in this telling, even when it costs me, I was 63 years old and I had loved this man. And love, even love that has been betrayed, does not simply revise itself into absence. It becomes something else. But the process of becoming requires acknowledgement, and I needed to give mine. He came to the house on a Sunday afternoon in December, standing on the front step with his coat and his careful eyes and the slightly diminished quality that I had noticed in him since the night he left. As though the removal from the house had removed some essential support structure, the way certain buildings, when a load-bearing wall is taken out, show the loss in the ceiling's new lean. I brought him into the living room. Same room where I had sat with Deja, same chairs. I spoke first. I told him that I did not hate him. This surprised him. I could see it in the slight recalibration of his posture. I told him that I had examined my marriage for the past several months with more rigor than I had ever examined anything, and I had concluded that what we had built together had been real, and that the reality of it did not excuse what he had done, but could not be nullified by it either. I told him that I was grieving the marriage, genuinely and without performance, and that the grief was mine to carry and not something I was depositing at his door. And then I told him what I needed him to hear. That the thing he had taken from me, the thing that had no equivalent in any legal document, that no equitable distribution of marital property could address, was the 11 years of ordinary mornings in which I had been present and faithful and completely in the dark. That I was not asking him to repay that, because some debts cannot be repaid, only acknowledged. But I needed him to know that I knew the full shape of it, and that I was not going to carry it as shame. It is not my shame, I said. It belongs to the choices that were made. I did not make those choices. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right." 2 words, unelaborated. And I want you to understand, I have sat with enough people in enough rooms to know when a person is performing contrition and when they are delivering it. What Leonard gave me in that moment was not performance. It was the specific, diminished gravity of a man who has arrived, finally, at the unmanaged truth of what he has done. It did not restore anything. I want to be clear about that. It did not restore anything because restoration was not what that conversation was for. What it did was close a door that had been standing open, letting in a cold draft since the coat room at Harvest House. Not all the way, but enough. He asked about Simone. I told him that Simone was his daughter and that what he built with her from this point forward was his responsibility to undertake, that I would not interfere, would not poison, would not use my daughter as an instrument of anything, that she was her own person with her own conclusions, and he would need to approach her on her terms, in her time, without using me as either a shield or a reference. He nodded. He left. I stood on the front step and watched him go again, a different quality of watching than the night he had packed his bag. That watching had been raw and necessary, the watching of a woman who needed to confirm with her eyes that the removal was real. This watching was something quieter. The watching of a woman closing a chapter, marking a page, setting the book down for the last time, not because the story was over, but because she had finally read to the end of the part that required her full attention. And the next chapter, her chapter, was ready to begin. I went inside. I called Simone. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was warm and immediate, and Deshawn's voice said something in the background that made her laugh before she could fully say hello. "Hey, Mama," she said. "Hey, baby," I said. "Tell me about your week." And she did. She told me about the new apartment and the neighbor who played jazz at a reasonable hour in the farmer's market she had found 3 blocks away, and the way Deshawn had come home the previous Tuesday with flowers for no reason, the way he did sometimes, quietly and without announcement. She told me about her week, and I sat in my living room and listened, and outside my garden held its winter shapes in the December dark, and the house was full of nothing but the sound of my daughter's voice and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of knowing that she is well. Spring came. I know that is not a dramatic thing to say after everything that preceded it, but I want you to understand what spring means in this particular story, in this particular garden, in the life of a 63-year-old woman who spent the winter doing the hardest work of her adult life and came out the other side into April like a person stepping out of a building after a long surgery. Careful, blinking, newly appreciative of light. The rose bushes came back. Of course they came back. That is what properly pruned roses do. That is the entire point of the cutting back. And I knew this when I cut them. But knowing and seeing are two different forms of belief, and when the first new growth appeared on the canes in early March, small, assertive, that particular red-tipped green that new rose growth has, the color of something that has decided to happen, I stood in my garden in my coat, and I held a moment of something that I do not have a cleaner word for than gratitude. Not gratitude for what I had been through, for what remained. The house on Pemberton Circle was mine. Vivian Grace Holloway had been thorough. The equitable distribution had recognized my 11 years of contribution, financial, domestic, the kind of contribution that does not always show up clearly in ledgers, but that careful legal argument can render visible. The house was mine. The retirement accounts, separated appropriately. A settlement that did not restore what had been taken, but that acknowledged, in the precise language of the law, that I had built something of value here and was entitled to its protection. Leonard was gone from the house and had stopped calling on Sundays, which we had both tacitly understood would eventually happen, and which, when it did, carried the particular relief of a finality that had been approaching for months. Deja and I had not spoken since her visit in October. I did not know the current shape of what existed between her and Leonard, and I had decided, with the full deliberateness of a woman who knows the difference between information she needs and information that would only hurt, that I did not need to know. Some doors you close, not because you are afraid of what is behind them, but because you have correctly identified that what is behind them is no longer your concern. What was my concern? Simone and Deshawn came home for Easter. We sat at the kitchen table and ate the meal I had been cooking for that table for 8 years, and we talked and laughed, and Deshawn, unprompted, helped me in the garden for 2 hours on Saturday afternoon and turned out to have surprising opinions about mulching that I respected deeply. Simone sat on the iron bench under the dogwood tree with her coffee and watched us work and said eventually, "You know what I see when I look at you, Mama." "What do you see?" I said, from my knees in the garden bed. "Someone who decided," she said, "just decided." I sat back on my heels and looked at my daughter in the April light, in the garden I had planted in the yard of the house that was mine, and I thought about all the things that decision had cost and all the things it had clarified and all the mornings between the coat room at Harvest House and this exact April Saturday that had required something from me that I had not been entirely certain I possessed until I found it waiting when I needed it. "That's all any of us can do," I said. "I know," she said, "but you did it well." Dorothy May came to dinner that Easter, as she has come to most of the significant tables of my life for 39 years, and she brought a sweet potato pie that she makes from a recipe that has been in our family longer than either of us has been alive. And she sat at my kitchen table in the spring evening and talked and laughed with Simone and Deshawn and told 3 stories she has told before that none of us would dream of stopping her from telling again. Later, after Simone and Deshawn had gone to the guest room and Dorothy May had gone home, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the last of the evening's tea in the settled quiet of a house that has been full of good company and is now content in its own company. I thought about the woman who had stood in the coat room at Harvest House on a September night, reading a message that was not meant for her eyes, in her husband's jacket, at her daughter's wedding. I thought about what she had known in that moment before she allowed herself to know it, the thing the body held before the mind was ready. She had been standing in the wreckage of something before she understood that the building had already fallen, and she had put the phone back in the pocket, and she had walked back into the room, and she had lifted her chin and picked up her glass, and she had said, internally, in the voice that no one else hears, the one that has been running underneath everything for 63 years, "You are Celestine Adaora Pruitt Monroe. Your mother gave you her spine and your father gave you his mind, and you've been building things from those materials your entire life. This is one more thing you are going to build. It will not look like what you expected, but it will be yours, completely and only yours." She had been right. Outside my kitchen window, the garden was dark, but present, the shapes of things I had grown and tended and cut back and watched return season after season with the reliable persistence of anything that has been properly rooted. The iron bench under the dogwood tree, the rose canes with their new red-tipped growth, the raised beds, ready for spring planting. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed in my house. I slept. Some stories end with triumph. Some end with peace. This one ends with sleep, the real kind. The kind that comes when a woman has finally set down everything that was never hers to carry and picked up, with both hands, everything that is. If any part of this story sat with you, if you recognized something in it, then you know exactly what I mean. And if you're still in the middle of your own coat room, still holding something you found that you weren't supposed to find, take your time. The truth doesn't hurry, but it always, always arrives.